an easy book to read. Job is the great sufferer. And you kind of suffer right along with him while you're reading the book. While Job is suffering physical and emotional pain, he's presented with arguments from his wife and later on from his friends. All of Job's and his wife's possessions are gone, and all of their 10 children have been lost. And each of them is literally the only person either one of them have left. And Job still refuses to relinquish his faith and give up on God. But what's the point? Why does God allow Job to suffer such emotional and physical pain? Is God allowing it to test or to prove the motives of Job's faithfulness? If so, why? God already said that Job is honest and upright and turns away from evil. So why? Why allow such pain? To some scholars, Job is the premier explanation of why bad things happen to good people. Job's story is relevant from ancient to current times because it offers a story that all humans can relate to, because all of us have at one time or another experienced undeserved suffering, or at least that's what it feels like to us. When we consider Job's story, it could tempt us to delete any belief that we reap what we sow. We could be tempted to believe that it justifies the perspective that the devil made me do it. Or don't look at me, Satan's work. And to add frustration to temptation, as we dig deeper into Job's story, we find that there's no answers to why. Why human suffering? Just examples about how we may choose to respond to suffering. Even though Job is brought so low that he argues with God and challenges God, even though later God's replies are not gentle or necessarily compassionate, Job remains faithful through whatever discourse with God he can muster up. Anger, begging, relentlessly claiming his faith. Job's response to criticism is that if we accept and expect God's blessing, we can accept and expect God to allow us to suffer. That just seems to be how Job is, but it's not very comforting, is it? When we consider how to apply the story of Job to our lives, it begs us to consider how we respond to suffering. What is our mindset? What are our temptations when we hit bottom? Personally, I don't like suffering or pain for myself or anyone else. As a friend once said, I'm against pain in all forms. I agree. No matter who's suffering, I'm against it. Which makes absolutely no difference at all, because people suffer anyway, and I'm included. No matter how good we are or try to be, sometimes apparently for no reason at all, whether it's a skinned knee or the loss of a limb, emotionally or mentally, socially or historically, we all experience pain and suffering at some point in our lives. And we all have the opportunity to choose how we suffer and our presence with our suffering. So maybe the fact that we're in pain, or why we're in pain, isn't as important as how we be in pain or how we survive it. Was Job being made perfect through his suffering? Maybe our scriptures from Hebrew can lead us to an answer, or at least a closer link. We don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, by the way. All we know is that it was originally a manuscript and then it was sent as a letter. What we do know is that it was written to a people who were suffering persecution for their faith so mercilessly that they were tempted to give up on their newfound Christianity and hope. And in answer to their suffering, the author of Hebrews points to Christ. And there is what could be a bridge to why God so blatantly allowed the suffering of Job. Does Job's story point to Christ? Christ was made perfect through his suffering. Is suffering an invitation to perfection, or do we benefit from our own suffering? I wonder. If I hadn't had a brain injury, would I understand how vulnerable and betraying it feels when our brain fails us? Can we honestly say that we understand what someone else is going through if we haven't experienced the same or similar circumstance? Is our increased understanding gained from suffering a tool to loving our neighbor as ourselves, as Jesus commanded? Is that the point? Jesus' humanity is indispensable to God's purpose of our redemption, because by the grace of God, Jesus tasted suffering and death to save our eternal souls. That is definitely the point to Jesus' suffering. So if perfection is the point, what is perfection in our humble state? Because I can't even see it from here. Jesus reached perfection through his journey of birth, suffering, death, and ascension. He was without flaws, wasn't he? Or wait, was Jesus without flaws when he lost his temper in the temple? Or when he rejected the Canaanite woman for not being a Jew? Was Jesus without flaw and when as a child he snuck off to a temple and caused his parents fear and concern until they found him days later? Does our objective need to be to gain perfection, or to consent to our individual journeys so that we may become better humans just one day at a time through the grace and companionship of the living God? All of those are great questions, but what about now, right now? What about being rejected and an outcast because we're different in our shape or our skin tone, or even our general appearance? What about being shunned and ignored because we're one of the unseen in a wheelchair, or because we're one of the unclean who have no place to live and no water with which to shower? What about those of us who are suffering through the grief of losing a loved one? What about those of us who have experienced violence and are suffering that aftermath? What about all that? None of those experiences feel like any road to perfection when we're experiencing them. They just feel awful. Suffering can make us feel like we're not worthy of living, or that we don't want to, or even that it's all our fault, when somewhere deep inside we're praying that it's not, and we know that it's not. But it's easier to blame ourselves when we can't find anyone else to blame. It gives us the illusion of power. So, what is the point? I believe that Job's story points to Jesus and teaches us that by holding on and by reaching out for help through our darkest journeys, we become equipped. Not with any visible or material equipment, but with internal, spiritual, mental, and emotional tools that we, through our suffering, become equipped to do God's work, to reflect the light of hope, the light of Christ that overcomes the darkness, that when someone in the midst of their suffering says, "No one understands," and they feel totally alone and isolated in their suffering, we can say, I do. I understand. I've been there. I've been where you are. And I know this is awful. I'm here. You are not alone. And by that gift, through our suffering, we are able and equipped to live out Christ's one commandment of compassion, loving others and loving ourselves. Those of us who have been in the dark, we are not afraid of the dark. We can help others find the spark of Christ's light to focus on. The hope of creation and the grace of God that turns all experiences to tools just by companionship. So the question becomes not what's the point, but are we willing? What gifts can we bring? We're called from our experiences to help others. That's our credibility. That's where it comes from. That's our road. We will all rest or have rested in the arms of Christ in the dark for a while. Then we rise up with Christ and serve the light from our darkness. I believe that is the point. That is the core of our Christian calling. To reach in, dig deep, reach up, and reach out. Repeat. And never, never stop praying. Always hold on. Dare to believe. Amen.